Weirding Way Media.
Night, Mr. Walters.
You see that guy over there? Now, he's an actor. The guy on the phone, he's a prize fighter. Me, I'm a cab driver. I'm the only cab driver in this place.
Good evening and welcome to Night, Mr. Walters, a taxi podcast. I'm your co-host, HP, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Father Malone. Father Malone, how are you this evening?
HP, I need you to know something right now. I do not record on January the 8th. Because that's Elvis's birthday.
That's Elvis's birthday. Now, that should be your clue. This is not going to be your typical episode of Night, Mr. Walters. We're in that sort of time between season 1 and season 2. So Father Malone and myself thought we would do something a little interesting, given that we haven't started season 2 yet. We're going to be looking into what I would call a taxi adjacent movie called DC Cab. Some of you may be familiar with it, but this movie came onto my radar as a result of hearing a discussion about the DC Cab soundtrack on the amazing $1 Billion Record podcast, which I would recommend anybody go check out. It's hilarious. Anyway, in chasing up more info on the movie, I was struck by the fact that professional Andy Kaufman friend and sometime Tony Clifton Bob Zamuda appeared in DC Cab. He's not featured prominently, but he's in it enough.
He's in it enough to make me hate him. The character, I mean, not Bob Zamuda. He's doing a good job, but I hate that fucking character.
The interesting part of it is I've been seeing this movie here and there over the course of the better part of 30 years, maybe more. And
40? What are you, nuts? 83, brother.
In all of this time, I never put together the fact that was Bob Zamuda playing this character. So I was really shocked to find out that he was in this. And of course, the tie-in, as I said, is because Andy Kaufman is in Taxi, of course, and they were buddies. At the time of the production of this movie, DC Cab, Taxi, the TV series, was still in production at that time. It would have been, I think, around the 5th season, the final season of Taxi. Not to say that there was any sort of Taxi influence on DC Cab, but it is sort of interesting. And there are some parallels to be seen, whether intentional or otherwise. I think they're unintentional. DC Cab was on cable a lot when Father Malone and I were kids. We saw it many, many times. I would have been about 10 when it was on. And certainly coming from a rather unsupervised childhood as far as watching cable, I probably saw this when I was far too young to really understand a lot of the humor and certainly a lot of the sexual situations, let's say.
Somewhere in a box, tucked neatly away, there is a videotape with a handmade label that was typed by me that says DC Cab somewhere in my sphere. If I chose to find it, I could. But yes, I've seen this movie not only from the onslaught that was delivered to us by cable television at the time, which was, again, pretty severe. This movie was on a lot, but I also videotaped it so I could watch it when it wasn't on.
I'm almost certain I videotaped it as well. But for me, I would videotape things and I would just put them on in the background, like the fish tank. It wasn't necessarily that I'd watch it with great intent. I would just put it on while I was doing other things because it was a known movie. It was a funny movie, at least for the time. In light of our examination of Taxi, the TV series, we thought it would be interesting to take a side trip here and delve into a taxi adjacent project like DC Cab. So let's get into DC Cab a little bit. Now, the stars of this movie features one of the more prodigious casts of the 80s.
Oh, it's an ensemble, baby. It's actually a remarkable ensemble when you look at it.
We have Max Gale, who, of course, is best known as Wojo from Barney Miller. Mr. T, which we'll talk a lot about coming up. Adam Baldwin, who was in My Bodyguard. That's what I know him from. Gary Busey, from just being Gary Busey, the nut.
Oh, come on, stop that. Gary Busey, Academy Award nominee for the Buddy Holly story. Yes, he's in this movie.
This is true. And I would actually say that his role as Joshua in Lethal Weapon, I thought he was very, very good in that because it was playing against type, right?
Are you implying that Gary Busey is not a fucking phenomenal actor?
I'm implying that the Gary Busey, the character, has supplanted Gary Busey, the excellent actor.
Right. Well, I maintain that up until, God, I can't remember the title of the film with Rutger Hauer, the Surviving the Game. up until Surviving the Game, we still get focused, good performances from Gary Busey. After that is when he becomes Gary Busey, the woohoo, I'm crazy all the time guy.
And I think that's fair. Actually, Surviving the Game, was that the one with Ice-T where
Yeah,
it was sort of like the most dangerous game? It was an update. Yeah, that was a good movie.
it is a good movie.
Ernest Dickerson directed that.
Goddamn right.
Spike Lee's longtime cinematographer.
Frequent director of photography of Tales from the Dark Side.
Yes, he probably made his bones as a director on Tales from the Dark Side, right?
Certainly did.
So in addition to Gary Busey, we have, I would say, a very young, but let's face it, all the actors in this are really young. Bill Maher is in this. He's so baby-faced. It's funny.
Unlined and weird looking.
And it's very easy to forget because he's been Bill Maher, the talk show host and Firebrand for so long that he was a comedian and he was an actor. He made a go of it. So it was shocking to see him in this. I forgot that he was in it.
House 2, he's in House 2, The Second Story. Or that he was in Cannibal Women in the Avocado Jungle of Death. Bill Maher was out there. He was working, man. His smugness has finally swallowed him up. But for a long stretch in the 80s and 90s, I was a big fan of his. Starting here, I think.
I would totally agree with you there. For a time, he was a welcome, sardonic presence in film and on TV. And I think you're right. I think his ego and his sort of shtick swallowed him up. And now it's indistinguishable from the real person. It's become the person. So also we have Charlie Barnett, which we'll talk about. There's some really interesting stuff with Charlie Barnett. Otis Day from Animal House, Otis Day and the Knights. He's in this movie. Paul Rodriguez.
Love Paul Rodriguez. Remember fucking Paul Rodriguez in the 80s?
He had a sitcom. What was it called?
AKA Pablo.
AKA Pablo. Yeah, I remember that was like a very highly touted series. It went nowhere. So you have these really up and coming comedians like Rodriguez and Barnett and Maher, but you also have Whitman Mayo from Sanford and Son, Grady, and you have this might be the debut of the Barbarian brothers, David and Peter Paul. I could be wrong about that.
Gotta love those barbarians, man. Marsha Warfield is also in this movie. We could mention her. Jill Shalin. I don't know.
I think it's Sholin.
Well, I'll go with Sheldon then. She's a huge 80s mainstay. She's a horror maven extraordinaire. She never gets mentioned, but she was a big scream queen.
One of my favorite sort of discoveries as I was rewatching this is the dispatcher, Miss Floyd, is played by an actress named Gloria Gifford, who you've seen her. She's been in a bunch of stuff, but for me, and maybe for you, Father Malone, I most fondly remember her as the airport security officer in This Is Spinal Tap, who stops Derek Smalls when he tries to go through with the foil wrapped zucchini, when she says, "Do you have any artificial plates or limbs?" Yeah. That's Gloria Gifford, which I love it. There's a few discoveries I made during watching this, and that was one of them.
And DeSalvo is also in this movie. I'm sorry, I'm just remembering the cast, and you're not naming a bunch of them. And I just need to mention some of them because they're all real good. This is a true ensemble movie. And
DeSalvo actually appeared in Taxi eventually. We will see. She plays, I believe she's like Tony's fiance or eventual fiance or something. I think they get paired up.
That's right. They do the road, and she's his equal. She's basically the female Tony.
Yeah, she's very tough. I think that was her stock in trade at the time. She was a tough talking New Yorker. I want to talk a little bit about Charlie Barnett because I confess I didn't know much about Charlie Barnett before or even going into this movie. And then I did a little bit of because I wondered, he's so prominently featured in this movie, but you haven't, I can't even think of another role that he's had, a prominent role.
What, are you crazy? Oh, no. I remember him very prominently on Miami Vice.
See, I didn't watch Miami Vice.
Multi-episode. And I thought he was going to be a huge star as well, because he is prominent in this movie and he's very, very funny in this movie. And I'm sure you're going to spill the SNL beans here.
You know exactly what I'm getting into here. He was a young comic on the rise in the late 70s in New York. And he auditioned for SNL in September 1980, and evidently then notorious producer, Gene Dumanian.
This is Lorne Michaels has finally left SNL after his 4-year run, and Gene Dumanian, his assistant, right, at the time?
Yeah.
Yeah, she gets to take over the show and has to restock the cast and ends up, some of them were pretty good cast members. I mean, she did pick Joe Piscopo, who ended up being a good cast member. She picked Gilbert Gottfried, who never got a shot on the show, but he would have been good. And Tony Rosato, was that her?
I think so. There, it was Denny Dillon was another one of the cast members.
Charlie
Piscopo,
Rocket,
Gilbert,
right?
Charlie Rocket, sadly faded.
He'd like to know who the fuck did it.
So that was the Charlene Tilton episode. I just rewatched that recently. She came into SNL in a very unenviable position, but anyone who's read any of the many books that have been out about the history of SNL knows that I said she was notorious, and she really was. I think the nickname that the cast members had for her was the Ayatollah Dumanian, among other things. She was looking to hire, as part of this new refresh of the cast, she was going to hire Charlie Barnett, but Barnett he had very poor reading skills. I guess he was next to illiterate.
He must have been dyslexic or something, like that's also a possibility,
It's possible. I mean, we're talking 40 years ago, 50 years ago almost, that it's possible that he had, who knows what he had going on, but he had very poor reading skills and he was tremendously self-conscious about it. So he didn't show up for his second audition, and lo and behold, Eddie Murphy gets hired in his place. Barnett would harbor great jealousy towards Murphy for years and years because he always believed that his spot on SNL and his eventual rise to fame should have been his.
He might have a case, actually, because Eddie Murphy was going to explode no matter what happened.
It's an interesting what if, because who knows what might have happened with Charlie Barnett. So what I also found out was Charlie Barnett was Dave Chappelle's mentor. Dave Chappelle was also a young comedian, didn't have a lot of experience. And Charlie Barnett's thing was he would go and perform outside. He would perform, I think, in Central Park, and he would pack them out outside. And he actually brought in Dave Chappelle, taught him the ropes a little bit, how to, I'm not going to say he taught him how to be a good comedian, but Chappelle has gone on record as saying that he was a big, big influence on him. And in fact, before Chappelle walked away from the Chappelle Show, there was a deal in place to do the Charlie Barnett biography, a film biography of Charlie Barnett that he was going to be involved in, if not star in. When Dave Chappelle walked away from everything and just quit the show, that project went away with him.
What a drag. I'd like to watch that movie.
It would have been interesting because I'm sure this guy's life, I'm reducing it to just a paragraph, but it sounds pretty amazing.
Oh, it's pretty harrowing there at the end too. So
Barnett would meet a very sad end. He died of AIDS due to being he was a heroin addict, and he would die of AIDS in 1996. So it's one of those great what if questions about what he could have achieved if he had had that opportunity. He's fantastic in DC Cab. He's very funny. He's a manic presence. He's great. It makes you wonder what could have been watching him. I should mention that DC Cab was written by Topper Carew and Joel Schumacher, and it was directed by Joel Schumacher.
Directorial debut?
It was not his directorial debut.
Well, no, he wrote Car Wash.
He directed The Incredible Shrinking Woman.
Before this?
Yes, a year prior. Yeah. Huh. This was only the second major film directed by Schumacher, the first being 1981's Incredible Shrinking Woman with Lily Tomlin. He would, of course, become a prominent director in the mid to late 80s. And into the 90s, he directed, St. Elmo's Fire, The Lost Boys, Flatliners, Falling Down, many, many others.
Batman.
So that was Batman and Robin. Did he direct that?
And Batman Forever, yes.
And Batman Forever. So he's widely credited with killing that Batman franchise, basically. Unfairly, perhaps.
Yeah, it was always going to crumble in the 90s anyway. Once Warner Brothers figured out that it was a merchandising machine, there was no way anyone was going to have a good vision for any of those movies. It was, they got exactly what they needed at the time, which was a pop culture-y, candy-colored looking thing. Joel Schumacher, this is his second film. He's a very sure-footed already, I got to say. It's very well directed.
He actually co-wrote it as well. So it's sort of interesting. I knew him primarily from his 80s and 90s heyday. And I've seen this movie many times without realizing who directed it. But I was kind of surprised to find out that he was so prominently featured as a director and writer. I thought that was kind of cool. We have to mention Mr. T. Mr. T was hugely famous at this time. I mean, he had just made his debut in Rocky III the year before, but he was still 1 year away from his best performance, which I think we both can agree was in 1984's Be Somebody or Be Somebody's Fool.
Oh my God, he's so good in that one.
His performance of the song Mother will bring a tear to your eye.
Other. There is no other. I pity the fool that we have to explain who Mr. T is to you.
It's really impossible to overstate how seismic Mr. T's debut in Rocky was. With the mohawk, with the gold chains, with the attitude. He didn't look or sound like anyone else. The pop culture explosion around Mr. T was tremendous. He was on Different Strokes. He was on the A-Team, was a tremendous hit.
He was at the White House with Nancy Reagan on his lap.
God bless him. He's still around now. He's not as active as he once was. The man must be in his late 70s, if not older. But he's still got the mohawk. He's still got the chains. He's still got the, everything. I mean, Mr. T is just one of those pop culture icons. And this was only his second feature film. So that was kind of cool.
By now, he was a huge star when this movie came out. This movie was made before, I think, he became Mr. T.
What's interesting is the character that he plays is this character called Samson. Out of all of the characters in this movie, and there's a lot of wacky characters we'll talk about, but Samson, you could make the case that Samson is essentially Mr. T.
Oh, yeah. They picked the right character for Mr. T to play in this movie. He effectively is playing Mr. T. So I couldn't imagine Bill Maher in this role and Mr. T and Bill Maher's.
It really does play to all of Mr. T's foibles. He's relentlessly positive. He's dressed just like Mr. T is in real life. He is concerned about the drug dealers and the pimps in his neighborhood, and he's trying to make something better. So this is really the Mr. T, the public persona depicted in a movie. You could forget about the name Samson. He's playing Mr. T, that for all intents and purposes.
I saw an interview with him for this movie where the interviewer said that she was disappointed because he has so many young fans and this is an R-rated film. And Mr. T vehemently agreed with her and said that he did everything he could to talk to the director and the producer to cut out the foul language because that was what was getting them the R rating. But he's at least proud to know that his character was upright and forthright. Like he went through the mud, but I came out clean. That was an actual quote.
The character of Clubber Lang, his debut in Rocky III, the thing that put him on the map is probably the thing that's furthest from the person that he at least likes to portray himself as.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
If any team had to hit first and he had blown up as Mr. T and gotten the serial and the cartoon series, would he have accepted the role of Clubber Lang after the fact? Like, had Rocky III come after? Like, see, Rocky III was in 1985, and they said, we want to get Mr. T to be the villain in this. I bet he would have said no.
He probably would have said no, because a cynic might say that he's just doing this to portray, who knows what he's like in real life. But I actually really suspect, I don't know the man, I've never met him, but I suspect that he is like that in real life. He's somebody who's very conscientious, likes to portray himself in a certain light. And that's actually a very interesting question. I agree with you. I don't think he would have done Rocky III. It is such a heavy character and a scary character, really. I mean, he's very much a villain in that movie. There's no doubt about it. He basically kills Mickey, right?
You know, people will say Drago, but I think Clubber Lang was the most frightening and fearsome villain in the Rocky universe.
He was, and it was like the perfect time for that perfect actor and the perfect part. It was really it was an interesting confluence of events that took place that made him into this superstar who is still known and recognized today.
Hey, woman. Hey, woman.
He really, I mean, even as a kid, I remember seeing that movie. He was a scary dude. He was tough. He didn't care. He was proudly defiant, and he whooped Rocky's ass.
HP, do you have a prediction for the fight?
Pain.
Do you remember when Mr. T first got celebrity before Rocky? He had won a strongman competition. It was like a big deal. It had been televised and such.
I heard that it was like a bouncer. It was like a toughest bouncer competition. I've never seen it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I don't. Maybe I mistitled it necessarily, but yeah, the world's toughest bouncer, basically.
I knew that that's what he did for work. He was a bodyguard and he was a bouncer. And believe me, if I saw somebody being guarded by Mr. T, I'd stay the hell away from them because that dude looks tough and he's big. Separate from this, I don't, just coincidentally, I was going down a rabbit hole and I found Mr. T famously did a WrestleMania. I think, was it WrestleMania 3?
Yeah, I know. It's WrestleMania. It was
The
numero
original.
uno, baby. Yeah.
Oh,
Hulk Hogan, Mr. T versus Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. For Christ's sake, HP, know your history.
I don't, but what I do know is the night before, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T were co-hosts on SNL.
You know, when you laugh, your little things there, they go, Bambi.
Fernando's Hideaway. But what I had been curious about is the cold open for that episode was they had just done We Are the World. They recorded it just recently.
Oh my God, yes, the Prince sketch.
Right.
I am also the world.
That's exactly right. So Prince didn't make it to We Are the World. And if you watch, there's this documentary on Netflix, which is actually pretty good, by the way, Father Malone. If you have, it's not long either. But the word at the time was Prince had to bail out a bodyguard because he'd gotten into some trouble. So the cold open for SNL was what you said, I Am Also the World. It featured Billy Crystal as Prince. And it was basically them recording We Are the World, but the bodyguards come in and every time like Paul Simon goes to the microphone or Willie Nelson or any of these, the bodyguards come in and put him in headlocks and beat him up. So everybody gets beaten up except for Prince. Basically, Billy Crystal's in blackface for this,
It's awful.
which might have been acceptable at that time, but certainly now it's shocking to see it. But I did find it. I thought maybe the internet had erased all vestige of existence, but it is there. You can find it. It's not very funny, but you do get to see Mr. T and Hulk Hogan in their prime, which is kind of cool.
There's one good sketch, and that's Christopher Guest as a guy trying to convince a family to send their child to Camp Crystal Lake for the summer.
I don't remember that. It's a Friday the 13th thing.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll have to try and check that out.
Featuring Hulk Hogan as Jason at the end.
Oh, he's got the mask. Okay.
And might I point out, if you go and watch this clip, that it's the incorrect hockey mask. And even at a young age, I went, that's wrong. It's one of those triangle holes all over the entire mask.
Right. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Pinpricks.
Hmm. Yeah, that was, I believe that was a Gary Kroger season of SNL also. That wasn't, I don't think, that was still I think, I wonder who the producer was at that time.
Dick Ebersol.
Dick Ebersol, you're absolutely right.
Okay, let's get off of Mr. T and back to DC Cab, shall we?
That's right. So DC Cab is really another in a long line of slobs versus snobs kind of movies that were super popular in the 70s and 80s. You have Animal House, Revenge of the Nerds, and so on. The film stars Baldwin as Albert Hockenberry, which is a name that I've never forgotten since I saw this movie. Hockenberry, it's a great name. So he's Albert Hockenberry. He's a young hayseed who comes to DC to make his fortune. His father served in Vietnam with Max Gale's character Harold, and he comes looking for Harold to get his help to make his fortune in the cab business.
HP,
And yeah.
I have a theory.
Do tell.
Albert Hockenberry's father in Vietnam went by the code name Animal Mother.
I was actually just leading up to that because there's this great scene where Harold and Albert are catching up. They're bonding over like pictures from Vietnam and relics from Vietnam, and this
Vietnam by Jimmy Cliff is playing. Should be pointed out.
Yes, which is it's a great scene because they're putting on gas masks and drinking beer through them, and they have flamethrowers and helmets and all this. And
it was like a good evening, honestly.
It did. It looked fun. I mean, they're drinking beers, they're reminiscing.
I wanted to pour through all that old surplus.
No, it looked like a lot of fun. Animal Mother is, of course, a reference to the movie Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece Full Metal Jacket, which featured Adam Baldwin in the role of Animal Mother. So I actually think that's a great tie-in. I didn't think of it in those terms, Father Malone, but yeah, maybe his father was Animal Mother.
Animal Mother's last name was Hockenberry. We just never heard it in the fucking movie. That's all.
He's good in it. He's very, very good in it. But yeah, I'm going to go with that. Hockenberry was Animal Mother. That's perfect.
HP, do you remember the first motion picture that we attended theatrically?
That would be Beetlejuice.
It wasn't Full Metal Jacket?
No, not at all. It was a sneak preview of Beetlejuice.
Oh, that's right. But we did see Full Metal Jacket together in the
Oh,
theater.
of course. Absolutely. Absolutely. We saw it. I don't recall the theater.
It was that twin that turned into the Hollywood theaters across from the Liberty Tree Mall.
Yes, it turned into Hollywood Hits. You're absolutely right.
Was it a General Cinemas?
It could have been. I
It
couldn't tell
was.
you for sure.
It's also where I saw the feature film Superman.
I saw Superman as well, but I saw it. There was a cinema in Peabody near the North Shore Mall. That's where I saw that.
Oh yeah, another two screen.
Yes, yes. DC Cab is filled with broad and over the top performances by eccentric performers. I have to say, Max Gale gives such a grounded, soulful performance as Harold. It's almost like he's in a different movie entirely. Don't you agree?
I 100% agree. I think he's, first of all, I think he's great in the ensemble of this movie, but he's so good that it ends up hinting at a better movie that's just out of reach. Like there, look, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this goddamn third act eventually, but Max Gale's presence and gravity and genial, you just like him so much and you want him to succeed. And there's a very sweet human story between him and Albert and Marshall Warfield's character. And there's a lot of good human drama going on here. And then there's a lot of crazy fucking bullshit.
And the crazy fucking bullshit really takes over the movie at the end in the third act.
Overwhelms it too. It's, yeah, oof.
You said it. You love the character of Harold. He's just so likable. You feel the fact that life isn't going his way. You feel bad for him and you want him to succeed. Like you said, he's great in this. And the stuff that establishes his connection to Albert, where they're talking about Albert's dad. And at one point, Harold even calls Albert by his dad's name. And it's an interesting moment. He keeps the movie, like I said, grounded. There could have been a very different movie had the tone matched Max Gale's performance that he was giving. But he's never not welcome. It's just the movie goes off the rails despite him, basically.
The movie is frequently going off the rails, and that's fine, but then it gets too much. But Max Gale, there's a moment in the movie which has always stuck with me where Harold and Myrna have kind of a tiff over the fact that Albert is there, and Albert suggests that he can leave and go get a hotel. And Max Gale says, as long as you're in DC, you're staying with Myrna and me. And he seems so heartfelt, like, you can always live in this house. That, yeah, it's just part and parcel to what we're saying about Max Gale. And this sort of not really DC Cab performance going on in the rest of DC Cab.
And he's the kind of person that you would want as your boss. Somebody who would go to bat for you. We'll talk about it, but he basically gives everything he has and more to try and get the company to succeed and to bring everybody along with him. Max Gale is so underrated, and he's really fabulous in this movie. Harold owns this ramshackle cab company, and it's populated by the kinds of characters that one only ever sees in movies. These are these actors that we've been talking about. Gary Busey plays an unhinged cabbie named Dell, but really he's just playing himself, or at least what we've grown to expect from Gary Busey, the kind of crazy, you never know what he's going to do. And it has to be said, the language primarily that comes from, and I'll just say the character of Dell, is so offensive to modern ears. I'm not going to go into it, but there's some really offensive stuff going on in this movie, language-wise.
Look, it's a product of its age. We're not condoning any of the problematic dialogue or situations or anything else from the bygone era of 1983. Look, some movies just did not age well. We don't want to revisit Revenge of the Nerds at this point and its complete rapey ending. It's a little harder to watch, and this isn't that bad. I don't feel guilty watching this. I just kind of wince every once in a while, remembering how casual some people were with some terminology.
Mr. T, as we said, he plays a character named Samson, who's just he's a really muscular, tough guy that's trying to keep his niece and the rest of the kids of the neighborhood from worshiping these ever-present pimps and drug dealers. They always seem to be turning up in the neighborhood with these really fancy cars. So he keeps saying, when he's talking, it's the car. I got to get the kids away from the cars. He also holds the record for the worst simulated driving of a car in a movie. Because there's a lot of driving in this, and we're not talking about the poor man's process that we've grown to love in Taxi, the TV series. These are cars that are getting towed and being filmed from the outside. So it looks like the cabbies are driving. But Mr. T, and none of them are really that good at it.
Disagree. Paul Rodriguez is really good at it.
You think he's good? Maybe I didn't focus on him enough.
Yeah, Paul Rodriguez is good. Everyone else is bad. Although I will say either Peter or David Paul driving backwards is doing a good job because they never stop looking forward and backward and forward and backward to see where they're going.
That's a good point. I didn't give him enough credit for that because he does. There's a scene where the cab can't drive forward, and the whole scene takes place, and he's talking to Albert while driving backwards down the streets of DC, which is actually, I'm laughing at it because it's kind of a funny scene.
A good scene. They're good in it. They're charming, those two.
They're such a punchline because they were the Barbarian brothers, and they made all these really bad direct-to-video movies in the 80s and 90s, but they're affable. That's the best I can say. They're affable. Bill Maher, he plays, I guess he's a frustrated musician named Baba.
Yeah.
And I only know that because there's a scene where he's supposed to be playing like a synthesizer in the garage to convey the fact that he's got all this talent, but he's wasting it as a cab driver.
Yeah, he's like an electronic kind of a musician. He's trying to break through in the music scene. Like, I don't know, somebody like Giorgio Moroder.
We're going to get to him too. Whitman Mayo, as I said, he plays an eccentric street person named Mr. Rhythm who speaks in riddles. He'll go up to one of the cabbies and they'll give him $1 and he'll tell them some sort of fortune or a riddle.
Don't let your dick run your life.
Right. Or the one that I always remember is Albert says, "Oh, what's the good word, Mr. Rhythm?" And he says, that can make you will also break you.
If you make it through the night without committing suicide, you're doing okay.
I guess nowadays he'd be called an unhoused person. He lives in a derelict cab outside the garage.
He's got it made right there. He takes everything, all the forgotten, lost and found stuff out of the cabs. He's doing all right.
Everybody loves him. Otis Day from Animal House, like I said, he plays a Jamaica-obsessed Rasta cabbie named Bongo.
Listen, he's not Otis Day here. He's Dwayne Jesse still here.
I think he was credited as Otis Day.
Right, incorrect.
Sorry, I got to go to IMDb. You're certain of this? You're willing to stake your reputation on this?
I will bet you something or other on that.
Yeah, it says Otis Day on IMDb. Oh, as Dwayne Jesse. Okay, you're right.
I guess I watched the actual movie with the credits. Speaking of credits, yellow credits. There's a little Taxi sort of tie-in, but it has one of my favorite credits of all time, Mr. T's credit, which comes up as Mr. and then it scrolls RST and then stops on T.
Oh, that's cool. The credits were interesting. Some of them are like little stylized stencils that will be spray painted, and then the person's name is left behind. It was actually kind of cool.
Yeah, those credits are just like, we are the 80s, motherfuckers.
They scream 80s, absolutely.
Doing it around the clock.
Another amazing casting discovery I made was at one point, there's a ski masked robber who keeps mugging Marsha Warfield's character, who's called Ophelia. And eventually Albert foils the robbery attempt and the robber's arrested. The robber was played by a man named Dennis Stewart. He was Craterface from Grease.
The Scorpion's doing here.
I was like, wow, that because his mask is ripped off at one point.
He was all over every 80s television series, the action wise. I know he probably tangled with Mr. T a few times on the A-Team.
He probably did. He had a sneer and he had a lane that he was very good. And there's another Taxi tie-in because he raced Danny Zuko for Pink Slips in Grease with Jeff Conaway, Bobby Wheeler from Taxi. So the hits just keep coming.
See that, folks? We're not just dicking around here with doing a DC Cab episode. We're tying it back to Taxi.
This all works. DC Cab's main competition in the movie is the Emerald Cab Company.
Ooh, I hate them.
It's an upscale garage. They're emerald, so they have green everything. The cabs are green. They wear these green satin jackets instead of the traditional yellow checker cabs. And this is where Bob Zmuda comes in. Bob Zmuda plays a character named Cubby.
Perfect name for that character, right? The blowhard. He's the real Cliff Clavin. Like if Cliff Clavin actually existed, he would be that guy.
Oh, that's a good call. He's very officious. He drives for Emerald and he really delights in keeping the DC cabbies in their place. He has a partner, but I don't know the other actor's name. I've
Jim
seen him in
Moody.
other things.
Jim Moody.
Jim Moody?
I believe it's Jim Moody.
Okay. What was he? What else was he in? Do you know?
I don't know. I remember him being something where he was very earnest and very nice. Whereas as opposed to here where he's very not very nice. Tom Zamuda, like when in his opening scene, like makes fun of Max Gale's character, makes fun of Harold because he was in Vietnam. He's singing the fucking Green Beret song at him, like taunting him. Like what a dick.
They're constantly trying to poach Marsha Warfield's character Ophelia away from DC Cab. Like they'll go to the equivalent of Mario's in DC Cab where they go to have breakfast. And these two sort of slimy Emerald cabbies will come over and go, when Ophelia, when are you going to come over and drive for Emerald? Get away from these suckers. And she is under a lot of stress because, as I kind of alluded to, Ophelia is constantly getting mugged by this one guy in a ski mask. And it's taken her to the breaking point. And at least in one case, she says she's going to quit. I think that's the scene you were talking about, Father Malone, where
Yeah, between her and Harold. Charms her back. Let's go have a drink and talk about this.
Harold is barely keeping things together, trying to keep the garage afloat. They're constantly under pressure from the head of the hack bureau. He keeps trying to shut the garage down.
The hack investigator.
That's it. And the actor, I don't have the actor's name, but he's this little sort of diminutive guy with a mustache who's always trying to stick it to DC Cab.
Here's the thing, because now we're mentioning the antagonists of the piece, right? These are the antagonists. Where they go in the third act of this fucking movie is absolutely bonkers. It's like, I know Joel Schumacher was totally sober at this point in his life, but what the fuck, man?
But up to this point, the plot makes sense. The garage is under threat of being closed down. There's cabbies that are threatening to quit. Things aren't going well. But Albert comes in and he's bringing this fresh enthusiasm. He's trying to get the cabbies to make something of themselves.
Let me make a taxi crossover possibility here. Albert Hockenberry, if they had hired him instead of John Burns, Albert Hockenberry would have lasted 5 seasons. Same character. He's a rube, right? Up from the South, in the big city, trying to make it in the cab company or whatever, like whatever thing they would have given him. But this guy in that role, stick him in a taxi, I think it'd work.
The difference is he's a rube, but there's nothing childlike about Albert Hockenberry. He's very focused on what he wants to do. He's come to DC to make his way, and eventually he wants to break into the cab business. So, and he knows when he comes in, he's got to be realistic. He's got to start from the bottom. He's got to get his hack license. A big part of the movie is almost episodic where he's driving with each and every one of these cabbies and learning from them and getting their perspective. And frankly, their perspective is usually about where to pick up women or how to do things the easy way instead of the right way. But that's the movie being a comedy. What are you going to do? Eventually, good fortune smiles on Harold's garage as they find a rare violin that was left in one of the cabs. And they cash.
Oh God, so hacky.
Very hacky. The reward is $10,000. But Harold's greedy wife, Myrna, takes the reward money for herself, and all the cabbies are understandably upset by this. But Albert, being the good guy he is, puts up $6,000 of his own money with the stipulation that they reinvested in DC Cab and they fix up the cabs, they get a new paint job on the garage and everything. Now, the thing of it is, $6,000, it's a lot of money, but it doesn't seem like a life-changing amount of money today. So I did the research. In 2024 dollars, $6,000 from 83 is worth approximately $18,579.34, which is a good amount of money. They could do something with that.
Certainly enough to fix up all the cabs and put up the sign and paint the bit, like everything we see that revitalizes the company. Yeah, definitely. Imagine what they could have done with 10.
$10,000, I'm glad you asked, would have been worth $30,965.56. So that would have been crazy.
They could have had television advertising for that kind of money.
That's true. But Albert, because he's that kind of guy, he's winning everybody over. He puts up his savings, back into DC Cab, and there's a great 80s montage of the garage getting fixed up. They're getting new fancy yellow satin jackets with
Oh
DC Cab
man,
on the back.
remember the satin jackets of the 1980s, man?
They look great. They look like a gang. It was a fantastic sequence. And they're finally are able to make payoffs so they can drive customers to the airport. And it's great. They upgrade the garage and the fleet. Things are looking up for DC Cab. But mainly beyond that, Albert's using his youthful enthusiasm to motivate the cabbies to make something of themselves. Even Samson takes his share of the reward.
Ugh.
And he he upgrades his cab. I think it's supposed to be a Rolls Royce. It's a Rolls Royce cab kind of smashed together, and he drives it to the neighborhood where the drug dealer is parked. And of course, all the kids now flock to Samson. He smiles because he's doing good work or whatever.
You haven't mentioned the best feature of the car, which is the little bubble dome on top that says DC Cab is shaped like the Capitol building, and it has a little airplane on a spindle that's spinning around the Capitol building. All the rest of the gold filigree nonsense that he's plastered all over the cab is unnecessary. All he needed was that plane.
So things are looking up, like I said, and here's where the third act comes in. Trouble strikes. Now, this is DC. And one of Albert's routes is he has to drop off, I think it's Tyrone's grandmother or aunt and cousin or something. He has to drop off two family members that work at an embassy school or something.
They're housekeepers at the embassy, nannies and housekeepers. And but we're never told what country they're from because the kids speak perfect English.
I assume maybe it's Canada. I don't know what country.
Canadian ambassadors' children? Oh my God. I hate every part of this sequence.
Through the movie, you see him dropping these housekeepers off, and these two little brats are always there, this boy and this girl, and they're always there waiting with eggs to start pelting the cab. It doesn't make any sense. They're just kind of assholes. And but one time, Albert's dropping off these ladies, and the kids get kidnapped.
By John Deal from fucking Miami Vice. Like there's a Miami Vice connection here.
I don't know if they're supposed to be radicals because they seem like crazy radical type people, but I think they're held for ransom. I think that's why. So they kidnap the kids, and in the ensuing craziness, Albert gets kidnapped as well, and they get taken to some farmhouse. The police believe that Albert was involved in the kidnapping somehow. I don't know how they made that, because there's witnesses to this kidnapping.
Here's the tension. Here's the plot of the movie. Evidently is that Albert gets kidnapped. He gets framed for the fucking kidnapping. And then these cabbies have to go save him while they're under suspicion. It's a mess, man.
It is a mess because within this whole thing that's happening is because Albert is suspected of being in on it, they close down the garage. So they're all out of work. They've reached their wits' end. No one wants to, they just want to give up. And it's Mr. T who rallies the troops with this patriotic speech that he makes. I think it's in front of the Lincoln Memorial or something.
Damn right. Truth is, Mark.
He marshals the troops. They finally find where they're holding Albert. And it's actually kind of funny because all the cabs line up outside. And through the whole movie, Harold has this bullhorn that he's using. I think it may be another thing from Vietnam or whatever. When the kidnappers hear someone's outside, and what the cabbies have done is they've all lined up. They have their headlights on so they can't see them, but somebody has found red and blue lights. So to the kidnappers, it looks like they're surrounded by the cops.
One of the cars has like pylons on top of it. Like those are lights.
Right.
Okay, look, the third act is a mess, but there are some charms, including when he's talking to them through the bullhorn. I think Gary Busey says, tell him you're Batman.
There's some funny, interesting moments. There's even a part where at one point Albert escapes and gets to the radio in his cab, but no one's in the garage because it's been shut down. But Mr. Rhythm intercepts the message, and he's talking to Mr. Rhythm, and he's saying, I don't know, I'm in a farmhouse. There's a windmill, and I see Bruce Lee. Mr. Rhythm gets this message, and then he meets up with the other cabbies, and he says, yeah, Albert, I talked to him. He said he's here, and he saw Bruce Lee. And they're all like, Bruce Lee, what are you talking about? So like one group led by Mr. T finds a farmhouse with Bruce Lee, Leigh, on a mailbox outside, and they're not sure.
This is the best part of the entire sequence. These three idiots pulling up to this house where it says Bruce Lee, Leigh, and one of the Barbarian brothers says, it says Bruce Leg. And then the family just kind of calmly eating their meal when the three of them crash in, one from the door and two from the windows on either side, and they just look up and go, oh, wrong house, and then leave. That's a great sight gag.
But eventually, Tyrone, who's also looking for Albert, he realizes that there's a drive-in screen, a movie screen, not far from the farmhouse. And you see him, he's screaming, Bruce Lee, Bruce Lee. And you see on the screen, I don't think it's a real Bruce Lee movie.
It is absolutely not a Bruce Lee movie.
They realize that the farmhouse is in view of a drive-in cinema not far. So anyway, craziness, hijinks ensue. They end up rescuing Albert. It's a high-speed chase. They pull him through the window in the van that he's being held in. Eventually, they rescue them. The kidnappers get arrested. Everyone figures out what was really happening. And the movie ends with, it's a literal ticker tape parade in D.C. to honor DC Cab.
Not the original ending, I understand.
If you notice, the Barbarian brothers, through the whole movie, have beards. But for this parade, they are clean shaven, and it's my understanding that there's some parts of the movie that either weren't filmed or are missing that explain why they're all of a sudden clean shaven, but that might go towards what you're describing.
Yes, evidently the original ending of the movie took place at the White House, where Irene Cara is performing and has invited Tyrone, who invites the rest of DC Cab. And that was the sequence. So it was her performing the title song while they're all there together. And that's the end. And then they decided they wanted something more dynamic after the movie had been already shot. So when they got back, the Barbarian brothers were clean shaven, and there's nothing they could do about that.
That makes sense. I should mention, we didn't talk about this. We'll talk about the soundtrack in a minute, but you did mention Irene Cara. Irene Cara, who at the time was red hot. She had done a bunch of movie soundtracks. She won an Oscar for the theme to Flashdance, I think.
She was the star of Fame, man.
That's true. She was super popular, and she had all kinds of songs on the charts. She appears in the movie as herself. The character of Tyrone is obsessed with Irene Cara and ends up picking her up, taking her to her hotel. And I guess to your point, they have made a connection. Maybe she would have invited them because she says, I'm singing at the White House, but nothing else becomes of it.
On the cutting room floor, like the famed ending of The Shining.
Was it filmed though? I guess it might. Okay.
There is a still. I haven't seen any footage of it, but there is a still of Irene Cara in like kind of a red dress performing that's attributed to the film. Like was a promotional shot that was released.
Makes sense. Actually, while we're talking about Irene Cara, we might as well talk a little bit about the soundtrack. The soundtrack for DC Cab was by Giorgio Moroder, who really was on a remarkable movie soundtrack run of his own at this point. He had done Flashdance, Cat People, Neverending Story, Top Gun. They all either were spearheaded by Moroder or heavily featured his contributions. Electric Dreams also he did.
My God, forever in Electric Dreams.
I just heard that the other day. It's crazy. Danger Zone, Lamal's Neverending Story, What a Feeling. These are monster soundtrack hits. Soundtracks were routinely in the top 10 of the charts.
Call Me, Debbie Harry, man.
Giorgio Moroder did that?
Yeah. Was it Call Me? Yeah, Call Me from the Richard
American
Gere,
Gigolo
Schrader movie, yes.
In addition to his contributions to electronic music in general, he was super hot as a soundtrack producer.
We're always in good hands when you saw Giorgio Moroder's name in the credits, you know. It was, in fact, when his credit came up here, I was like, I lost my mind. I was like, whoa, what a treat. I had no idea.
I will say, aside from the songs that are recorded for the soundtrack, like you have like El DeBarge does a song and a few other bands, but the instrumental music, I don't know about you, I found it really, really shrill and kind of annoying. There's a lot of like, like as cars are racing around. That was a little much.
I think it's totally in keeping with how bullshit the fucking ending was.
The lead single for DC Cab was a song called The Dream, subtitled Hold On to Your Dream. This was Irene Cara singing. This was supposed to be their big hit. And I remember it being on MTV a lot because I recognized the song, but apparently it peaked at number 37 on the Billboard Hot 100. It didn't really make much of an impact. I think this might have been the beginning of the end of Irene Cara and Giorgio Moroder's dominance of the soundtrack sort of charts.
You know what's weird? In Electric Dreams on that soundtrack, there's a song called "The Dream,"
Boy
but
George.
George performs. Yeah, it's just so when I hear "The Dream," I automatically think of that, which is also tied to Giorgio Moroder. That's just an odd coincidence.
I really, really liked the Electric Dreams soundtrack. I remember at the time watching that movie, and that's a fantastic sequence. There's a sequence where the computer, I think the guy brought the computer so it would design an earthquake-proof brick.
Yes.
And while the computer is working on this brick, that song "The Dream" by Boy George is playing. It's a wonderfully mellow, kind of ethereal song. It's beautiful.
It's a gorgeous sequence, and it's the best part of that movie, honestly. I mean,
Yeah,
look, there are other charms in that film, like Bud Cort clearly is just so wonderful.
he's
But
tremendous. Yeah.
that sequence in particular, I agree, is just a delight.
So that's the movie in a nutshell. Like I said, we've covered the actors and everything else. And I have to say, coming into it, we're not going to rate this as we would. There's no yellow lights here. We can talk a
We
little.
haven't mentioned some things that I enjoyed about the movie, though.
So I've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts of the movie, but let's get into some other things, Father Malone. What else did you come up with in your research?
No research at all. This is just something I liked about the movie because this is an ensemble movie, and I really liked hanging around with them. That I will say that it feels like, and this is obviously not the case. This was written as a feature film, originally Liberty Cab. I did research that. That was the original title, and I got to read a couple of the early pages of the script, only a little sample.
I give them credit for setting this movie in Washington because I mean, it would have been so easy just to say that this was taking place in New York because all you need is basically an inner city, right?
Right.
But having said that, despite the fact that I think it's cool that they went with a different type of setting, aside from the fact that these kids that are kidnapped are children of ambassadors, it doesn't really figure in. You could have very easily have said this is in New York, and no one would have batted an eyelash. There's nothing
Oh,
unique about this.
I disagree with you on that. I like that it's set in DC, and I like seeing all of the sort of regular landmarks, but then a lot of these sort of local landmarks that you would seek out if you were there. I think they use those neighborhoods pretty spectacularly. And the point I was making earlier about the screenplay is that because the third act is so goddamn jarring, what it feels like is a pilot and a first episode, but we never got a resolution to the pilot before we got this second crazy plot, like this seems like, if anything, it could have been the sequel plot. Like, had this movie been a hit where we're just dealing with the cabbies and whatever little problem they've come up with, the hack investigator or the Emerald Cab Company, like some sort of, it's just so, oof, I'm sorry. I don't mean to keep returning to it, but here's something I did like. The sense of camaraderie in these characters is really infectious, including this game that they all play with each other, this sort of hide and seek, where they're all dressed in masks, hunting a particular mark for the night, and while all the time playing the Mission Impossible theme on their shitty tape decks in their cabs and singing along to it, and then singing over the mic to the point where they can't, like, the dispatcher can't even find a cab to go pick up an actual customer. That I loved.
I was thinking about this as I was watching this movie. We saw this when we were super young, and there were a lot of movies like this where it's like an us against them type of thing, where you have a tightly knit group of people working somewhere or friends, like Revenge of the Nerds. They're all in the same frat. And this kind of, in a weird way, this kind of warped my thinking of what it was going to be like once I got a job later in life. Like, in my mind, like wherever I worked, I was going to be part of a crazy band of people. We were all going to love each other and support each other. And I had this impression that I was going to be best buddies with everybody that I ever worked with, wherever I decided to work. And that's obviously, I learned later that's not the case, but this movie conveys that idea very well. These are very different characters, but you can tell they all love each other. They support each other.
And there's something spectacular about, in 1983, the diversity on screen here.
That is true. It's never even really discussed as being odd or progressive. They're just all friends, and they don't care. There's like the Rasta guy, there's the Gary Busey crazy white guy. But they don't really call out their differences in any interesting way. They all go to this. Like at one point, all the cabbies go to like a male strip club to try and pick up women. They don't care. They're just going to have a good time. The only person who gets excluded is Albert because he's the odd man out. He's the new guy. And there's also, we didn't actually mention, there's this subplot involving this waitress or this girl who works at a restaurant, the cabbie hangout.
Jolin?
Jill Sholin. I think
Jalen?
I don't, what's her name? Claudette. Her name is Claudette. And Albert it's love at first sight. Albert is struck with love, but.
Dun, dun, dun. Her controlling aunt who runs the coffee shop will not let her date any cabbie. And she's right to do that. God, they're all so gross and crazy. They're constantly getting into fights and jumping out windows in this fucking diner, standing on tables and yelling at each other. Like, I wouldn't let her date them either. But she has conditions that someday someone's going to walk through that door with flowers and chocolates and some other gifts and going to ask properly. And Albert fucking does it, man. And that box of chocolates looked delicious. And I want to look through that book of great homes of the South.
Albert is a good guy.
He's fucking charming in this movie. Like, I really like Albert Hockenberry. I wanted to be friends with Albert Hockenberry.
He was so good in My Bodyguard. He plays Linderman, the scary character in the school where Clifford Peach is getting bullied. And Clifford Peach realizes he better hire his own bodyguard to keep the bullies away. And Linderman, being the scariest dude in the school, played by Adam Baldwin, is hired. And through the course of the movie, Clifford and Linderman, they become friends. And he learns about Linderman and why he is the way he is. He was really good in it. It's a total 180 from Albert Hockenberry. He has to be sullen and depressed and angry. And these are, I don't think any of those adjectives would describe Albert Hockenberry in the least.
I watched Full Metal Jacket last night. I haven't seen it in 20 years.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah, a long time.
He's terrifying in the movie.
He's really good.
His opening scene, the cadence with which he's speaking to Joker when he first meets him, this sort of weird, laconic, threatening, but soft, it's really off-putting. Like, he throws you way off kilter. And that follows through the rest of the movie, man. Like, it just gets more aggressive and horrifying.
As I said, it's a masterpiece anyway, but he is really good in it. Everything I've seen him in, and I didn't watch Firefly. I didn't watch and I understand that he's like a cult favorite from that TV show, as a lot of the actors.
He's a solid performer. I've never seen a bad performance by the guy.
But he's really good in this. There's no subterfuge with Albert. He genuinely wants to succeed and take everybody with him. They all eventually, like, because he comes in and they all ignore him. They all give him the cold shoulder, like, nah, you can't drive with me. But they see what an earnest, hardworking guy that he is, and he genuinely wants the company to succeed, that he wins them over. Even Tyrone is the hardest nut for Albert to crack. Everybody else eventually comes around. But Tyrone, there's something about Tyrone and that character that you learn that I think he went to college, but he realized that he couldn't make it because the cards were stacked against him, and he just decided to become this crazy guy. But Albert doesn't care. Albert's just trying to make something of himself, and they eventually become friends, and Tyrone is the one who leads the charge effectively to find Albert when he's been kidnapped. I have to say, Charlie Barnett, we've talked a lot about his sad history. He's really good in this as well. He's really funny.
He's not only really funny, he's good in the dramatic moments too. He's solid throughout this entire movie. Like, I don't know why he didn't just blow up immediately.
It sounds like he had already inked a 3-picture deal with, I don't know, Paramount or one of these companies. I just don't know what became of it. Was he just too crazy that maybe people didn't want to work with him? Or I don't know. But I do wish that Dave Chappelle's movie biopic of Charlie Barnett had gotten off the ground, because I think there's a really great story there. There's a tremendous what might have been with this guy. Totally. Imagine if he had gone on to stardom on SNL. He might have, for all we know, he might have still flamed out. He might still have not amounted to anything, but we'll never know. He
Yeah,
never,
he could
he
have been
never,
one of the casualties from that season. Most of that cast got fired immediately.
I don't know. It's heartbreaking to see somebody who has such a prodigious talent, and to hear what a sad end he came to was really a bummer, because he's so vital and so exciting in this. You got the sense that he was making the most of this opportunity in this movie because this was his first movie. Everybody really is, for what the movie is, they're good. And looking at this as kind of a hangout movie, it's not really a hangout movie, but you do, these are affable, funny characters that you would like to spend some time with. They're always doing crazy things. Like you said, they're playing this sort of fox hunt game at the beginning where they're chasing each other in cabs and wearing masks. And
I love it. It's like a fucking blast.
yeah, it looks really, really fun.
I want to play the game that Dell wants to play. You take a beer bottle and you spin the bottle, and then whoever gets that has to take it and they shake it up. They shake it up real, and then they put it right next to their face. I don't think that's in the script. I think that's just Gary Busey bringing that,
That's the thing. We have the benefit of 40 years of Gary Busey antics to look back on. And honestly, I wasn't kidding when I said that it seems like he's essentially playing himself in this, which is funny because he's had other parts. Like he was in, like, I can't say that about Point Break. He was fine in Point Break as the cop. In this one in particular, it just feels like that's who he is based on seeing him in the public eye over the past 20, 25 years or so, It's not a stretch. I could see that being something that wasn't written. Maybe Schumacher's like, hey, remember that story you were telling me, Gary, about, what you used to do with the kids in the neighborhood? Why don't you throw that into the scene?
I guarantee you it emanated from Mr. Busey in some way. I might be wrong. I don't know. Somebody will pull up the script and tell me I'm wrong.
But there's weird stuff. At one point, Albert's having a conversation with somebody, and he looks in the bathroom, and Dell is on his back in one of the stalls. And Albert goes like, well, what are you doing in there? And he goes, I'm doing some intestinal yoga.
He's a fucking lunatic. You know what's wrong? You know the only thing wrong with oral sex? The view.
It's good. It's good.
I'm recommending this movie. There's a lot of problematic humor in this movie. A lot of race bullshit. A lot of juvenile nonsense. There's a lot of fucking funny stuff too. Gary Busey front and center.
Yeah. It's not unlike a movie like 48 Hours, where a lot of people have contended that you couldn't make a 48 Hours movie now because it's just so, the way that Eddie Murphy's character is treated in the language is just so offensive now.
You couldn't make it now because it's not now. That movie isn't now. That it's of its time. Like, I look at these movies and yeah, I wince when I hear people say some of the stuff they're saying, but at the same time, that was 1983. And so yes, you could not make DC Cab now. You could not make 48 Hours now. You just would make it with today's sensibilities, and that would be fine. There's some not necessarily prescient stuff, but just like as a wake-up call, like how long this has been going on. When Albert and Tyrone like make their way back to the cab company with the fucking thief who's been pestering Marshall Warfield the entire time, when Tyrone gets the gun from the guy, they pull up to the cab, the cops grab Tyrone and wrestle him to the ground like he's the guy. And he's like, he's not the... and he's just like, yeah, of course they're going to attack me.
He says that. He literally says that. I'm here with a gun. Of course they're going to tackle me. And that's really sad that here we are 40 years later. And that's, not only is that still happening, but it's in a much worse sense.
Now at least everyone's woken up to it. Like it was like a punchline.
I think to alter or censor something like this to make it more palatable to modern audiences, I think, is to run the risk that you're going to forget that these things were problematic in the first place. I'd rather go into it, and I'm not even suggesting you put on, like, I know some movies have a little lead card that says, we regret some of the language.
Look, but it was fucking 40 years ago and everyone was an idiot out in the open.
I think people should understand that this is 1983. Things were different.
Dell is there to let you know that the cops are lacing the bullets with PCP. That way it looked like you were on drugs the whole time.
I didn't realize how much of DC Cab is almost episodic, because a lot of it is just Albert going on rides with the various cabbies and getting into sort of strange, almost like encapsulated adventures. He goes with Dell and they drive a stripper to a topless club. and the stripper stiffs them. So then Albert has to go in and try and get the money, and he gets kicked out. Then Dell has to go in, and it's funny because he goes in there and he rips off the bottom of one of the waitress that stiffed him. I don't know if you noticed this, but so he runs out.
What else does he grab? He grabs like a handful of food, right?
Well, no, he runs out. He grabs the bikini bottom.
Oh, a
and
statue. He grabs a little statue.
Yeah, you don't see it, but he dives into the cab and he's holding this little white statue in his hand. It's really funny.
Magic of Gary Busey.
It sounds like what we're describing is like an outrageous comedy, and there are certain elements of that.
It's pretty grounded for a lot of it.
There's a charm to a lot of it. And like I said, a big part of that is due, I think, to the direction. And I think Max Gale adds a nice vibe to the picture. Adam Baldwin, his character is great. We haven't talked about the cinematography. And for this, I want to cede the floor because I'm sure you have a lot to say about the director of photography.
No, who's the director of photography?
Are you kidding me?
No.
This is one of the dingiest, dirtiest depictions of DC that you'll ever see. Every cab, it feels like there's a funk inside of every cab. It's dirty. There's like soot over everything. You can practically smell it all over the garage. But worth noting is the DP of this picture was Dean Cundy.
Oh my God. Yeah. I'm so sorry. I feel like covered in shame here. Like, yeah, I did notice in the credits like this. I got so I was marveling at like each credit after another that yeah, it slipped my mind. Shame on me because it is a spectacularly well shot movie. You're right.
Yeah.
Like nobody can shoot grime like Dean Cundy to make it look cinematic and beautiful and authentic at the same time. Like how do you make grime look wonderful?
It came back to Escape from New York, which I would say is similarly. I mean, we know that was shot in St. Louis, right?
Yeah.
And it looks and feels so authentically urban and dirty. I know a good portion of DC Cab was shot on location, but I also know that a lot of it was shot in Los Angeles. I couldn't tell you which parts, probably some of the interiors, but there's a gravitas to the way it's shot. I'll give you another example when we're talking about Harold's house where Albert is staying. All you ever see is really just like, it's like the living room where Albert is just sleeping on the couch, but it looks so real to me. It's sort of dirty. There's a part of the wall where the studs are exposed. It looks like a lived in crap house in the middle of the city somewhere.
I'm now thinking of like 3 different Dean Cundy movies where he shot night scenes. So Escape from New York, which is so spectacular and like bright in a way, like all of those streets are like very well lit, but realistic. And then we have this movie. And then we also have Back to the Future, which features a bunch of night scenes. Each of them are so delicate and wonderful and perfect and of the movie. Like I couldn't necessarily say that that's Dean Cundy's style on each of those movies because they're so well suited to each of the films. He's fucking fantastic, man. Like, why is he not more well sung?
I mean, I don't know if he's won any Academy Awards. I would hope so. But if not, at least he should be up for like a Lifetime Achievement Award purely for his work with John Carpenter, if nothing else.
Hey, man, he shot The Thing and Roller Boogie. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's fucking fantastic. Like, I don't know. We should start a Cundy cast.
You were talking about Back to the Future. It couldn't be more different than The Thing or Escape from New York, but it serves the picture so perfectly. And I would say the same thing is true for DC Cab. It seems silly to be delving into the aesthetics of a silly movie from the 80s, but damn if it doesn't look really, really good and it feels authentic, right?
Absolutely. More often than not, we run into these set-bound things and the lighting is inelegant, and that's never the case with Dean Cundy. He can make anything look like you're in a real space and not just some set somewhere. He shot fucking Who Framed Roger Rabbit, man. He made it seem like I felt transported to 1940s Los Angeles. It never felt unreal to me. There were fucking cartoon characters running
Yeah,
around.
I know. The man was a magician with light and with sets and with everything. It was, let me think about this for a minute now. In terms of time frame, DC Cab, that was certainly after The Fog and after Escape from New York. So it's not as if he wasn't already an established and well-respected DP. So I think it's actually kind of marvelous that he would do like a movie like DC Cab. I mean, I'm sure it's a job and he likes to get paid, but it's not like he coasted on his abilities. It looked and felt great. Whatever the other shortcomings of the movie are, it looked and was shot beautifully.
Clearly, here's a man who just likes to shoot movies and fucking does not matter the genre or the budget. If he's interested, he's going to go. And thank God he did for so many, many of my favorite movies of all time.
I came into rewatching this movie, and I feel like I've said similar things in our taxi discussions, but I came in thinking, I'm sure this is just going to be a juvenile thing that I fondly remembered as a kid, but maybe it doesn't hold up. But and there's certainly aspects of that. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is like a Citizen Kane of the 80s. But I will say, and we started to mention this a little earlier, is if you can see past some of the more juvenile and offensive bits of this movie, there is a charm. And the cast is wonderful. They're all young, and some of them really surprisingly good for based on what they've done after the fact. I was charmed by this movie in a way that I wasn't expecting to be. And I don't think that was just purely nostalgia. I think looked at it on its own merits, I think it was actually kind of a successful movie for what it wanted to be. What did you think, Father Malone?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I knew even as a child there were portions of this movie that were ridiculously juvenile, sub Animal House, like let's shock the audience because that's what they like. But there's also like you and I have spoken on Chris Stashew's podcast, the Culture Cast, about the film Heaven Help Us. Similar kind of thing where there's a sweet movie in there and then it's kind of surrounded by Porky's like humor because that was the style of the time. And this film suffers a lot from that, but there is a very nice human drama going on here between Max Gale and Adam Baldwin. And I don't know, there's a comfortableness with this film. Like it's got a nice hangout vibe.
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to earlier. It's fun to spend time in this garage with these characters, some of them off the wall, but it is
It's a shame
fun.
that they felt like there had to be a plot at some point. Like we really didn't need it. The movie, the problem is the actual ending to the movie is the end of the second act when Albert gives them all the money and they revitalize the cab company. That should have been the fun finale. Like, I don't know why they decided they needed to have intrigue.
You said it. It really went off the rails when you introduce these ambassadors kids and Albert getting kidnapped, and now it becomes a race to save Albert. It didn't need that. That to me, in a movie that isn't all that realistic necessarily to begin with, this just takes it that unreality to a whole nother level, which I don't think it really needed. The spectacle of them driving down whatever street in Washington, D.C., as they're throwing a ticker tape parade for them was so unbelievable to me and so silly. But even despite that, there's one moment where the hack inspector, or whatever his name is, gives Harold the plaque,
Yeah.
and he picks up the plaque and he kind of shows it around. It felt real to me. It felt like, wow, this is how somebody who gets an award would I don't know. In the midst of all of
It's
this,
just the joy of Max Gale, man. He's so good. Like,
he's so
yeah.
good. I confess I didn't watch a lot of Barney Miller as a kid because if it wasn't an action-packed thrill a minute, it seemed boring and adult to me. And there's really nothing action-packed about your average episode of Barney Miller.
Like a bunch of adult world wordplay. Like, who cares? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Oh, but it's been so highly touted as a good show. And the
It
actors.
is absolutely a great show. It's just not for 10-year-olds.
Right. And I could say the same thing for Taxi, when I was a little kid. I remember it would come on just as I was getting ready to go to bed to get ready for school the next day. And there was a time where if I heard that end theme of Taxi or heard the start of the MASH theme,
Oof.
I got this
Double
pit in my
whammy
stomach.
of melancholy.
Yeah, because you knew, oh, it's time for bed. I'm going to wake up and it's going to be school again tomorrow. So there was a time when that was antithetical to fun for me, but maybe I should go back and watch Barney Miller and catch up on Hal Linden and the rest of the group, you know? Steve Landisberg, wasn't he in that?
Sure was.
He was.
Steve Lagoda.
That's right, Fish. He was in it.
You know, our pals over at Weirding Way Media have a shabby detective podcast about this. No, that's the Columbo podcast.
That's
But
Columbo.
They also have a Barney Miller
They
podcast.
do. Oh, okay. I will
Yeah.
I'll have to consider checking that out. Again, if it's not already clear, for whatever passes for yellow lights in this particular episode, we're giving DC Cab a recommendation. You should definitely check it out. It's got nothing to do with Taxi, the TV series, of course, but as an adjacent depiction of the cabbie lifestyle, it was pretty
Hey, baby,
good.
we're between seasons, so we're doing taxi things. We might do a taxi driver. Who knows?
I think that'll do it for this particular special episode of Night Mr. Walters. Father Malone, when you're not discussing obscure 80s comedies, where can people find you?
You can hear me over at Weirding Way Media. I host a show called Midnight Viewing, the horror anthology podcast with Mike White and Chris Dasher, where we discuss, well, we're now starting to discuss Tales from the Dark Side. We've got our first Tales from the Dark Side episode coming up, where we have an interview with Robert Draper, who's the director of photography for like 16 episodes. And that's where you can find me, over at the Midnight Viewing.
I am also proud to be part of the Weirding Way Media Network. You can hear me on the Noise Junkies podcast with myself, Father Malone, and Mondo Heather's Heather Drain. You can also hear I've done a few things here and there for Father Malone's Dark Destinations podcast, which I would encourage you to check out if you love great audio drama. I have a Bandcamp site, hpmusicplace.bandcamp.com. If you want to check that out as well, I'd appreciate it. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to subscribe to the podcast, write a review, rate us. We would love to hear from you in any manner that you choose. For myself and for Father Malone, thanks again, and we will see you again next time.